So some of you have asked about the phases of the moon, what they are and how they occur.
So the first thing you need to know is that the moon doesn't emit its own light. The sun emits its own light, but the moon only reflects light, which means that only half of the moon will ever be illuminated, because the other half is behind the moon, and so the light rays don't reach them. So only half the moon is ever illuminated at any one time.
And the moon, since it doesn't reflect or doesn't emit its own light, it reflects sunlight, and it reflects about 7% of the sunlight.
And that's called its albedo, how much of the light that it receives it reflects.
And when it's a full moon, that makes it 400,000 times dimmer than the sun.
Now, it doesn't seem like it's 400,000 times dimmer. It seems like it's dimmer, but not that much. And that's just because the moon's a lot closer to us than the sun is. And as light travels through space, it loses intensity.
And so, we're going to start with a video of the phases of the moon. We made it ourselves, and we're going to start with new moon, and then it will slowly progress to waxing crescent. And it's waxing because that's just the term for more of the moon's light being showed. And it's a crescent because a crescent is a bread that's shaped in that shape.
And so what that means is that only a small amount of the half of the moon that's illuminated we're seeing. So it's only a small amount of it.
And then it's going to progress to first quarter.
It's called a first quarter even though we see half the moon. Well, remember, only half the moon is illuminated. So if we're seeing half of the half that's illuminated, that's a quarter. So when it's first quarter, we're actually only seeing a quarter of the moon. Even though you think it would be half, that's because we never see the far side of the moon. So in reality, we're only seeing a quarter of it.
And then next, the moon will go to waxing gibbous, which means it's still progressing, the waxing. And gibbous just means more than 50% of it is illuminated. And gibbous is Latin for humped. And it kind of looks like it's humped because it's not quite full.
So then you move to a full moon, which means you see the entire moon. The entire half that's illuminated anyways. And so that means that the moon is on the opposite side of the Earth from the sun, and so all the light that hits the moon is reflected back towards us. So the half that's illuminated, you're seeing that entire half. And so that's why we call it a full moon.
And then after the full moon, it starts going back down the cycle, but now it's going to progress to a waning gibbous, which means less light is going to be showed. That's the waning part. And gibbous is less or more than half of the moon illuminated, so it's just going to go back down.
And so then you get to the third quarter, or the last quarter, and so that just means that at this point you're at the last time in the moon cycle that you're going to be seeing a quarter of the moon, which again seems like it should be half, but it's just half of a half, and before you get back to new moon. So we consider new moon new where it starts, so then it's last quarter because it's reaching the end.
And then after last quarter, you're going to reach waning crescent. And you'll notice that now the illuminated part is on the other side of the moon than it was when it was waxing crescent. It's because it's on the other side of Earth.
And so then you get back to new moon, which means that the moon is on the same side as the sun. And so what that means is that all the light that the sun emits and then bounces off the moon is reflected back towards the sun and not towards us. So the half of the moon that we're seeing is the half that isn't illuminated. And so that's why you can't see it.
And there is a misconception. Some people think that new moon is because the moon passes through Earth's shadow. But in reality, the moon is 5 degrees above or below the Earth's shadow most of the time. Sometimes it passes through. And when it does, you get this.
And so when the moon passes through Earth's shadow, that's called a lunar eclipse. And this is a lot more common than a solar eclipse because the Earth is bigger than the moon, so it has a bigger shadow. And so what will happen during a lunar eclipse is that it's on the opposite side of the Earth from the sun, so you're getting all the light reflected back towards the Earth, but then it moves through the Earth's shadow, and so now there's no light from the sun that's hitting the moon. And so it drops back to a new moon really quickly. Even though it's not called that, it looks the same because there's no light being reflected back. And then it moves out of the Earth's shadow and goes back to a full moon.
So now you'll watch a solar eclipse, which is different than a lunar eclipse, because in a lunar eclipse, the moon passes through the Earth's shadow, but in a solar eclipse, the moon passes in front of the sun, casting a shadow on Earth.
And so a solar eclipse isn't as common because, again, the moon is smaller than the Earth, and so its shadow is also smaller. And so it's less likely for the Earth to pass through the moon's shadow than it is for the moon to pass through the Earth's shadow. But with a solar eclipse, remember, the moon will be on the same side of the sun as the Earth, so it will be a new moon. And then as it passes in front of the sun, you would see the sun be blocked out. The light will be blocked out. And then you can see things called solar flares, which are just basically magnetic eruptions from the sun. Normally the sun's too bright and it drowns out that light, but with the moon passing in front of it, you can see these solar flares behind the moon.
And also, when the moon passes in front of the sun, it blocks it out almost perfectly, revealing the sun's corona, or kind of like the atmosphere of the sun.
And that's because the sun is about 400 times the radius of the moon, but the sun is about 400 times farther away. So the sun and moon are pretty close to the same size in the sky.